Hey, everybody, and welcome to the podcast. I'm Stephen.
And I'm Daniel.
And today we're going to be re-envisioning and reconstructing a second century Mass, a second century liturgy, Eucharistic gathering of the earliest Christians. But before we do that, if you like what we're doing here, if you like our first 500-year series, do all the things. Be sure to subscribe, like the video, comment. We do try to respond to every single comment. And, Dan?
Oh yeah, tap the bell for notifications when a new episode.
I'm just glad.
drops.
I'm glad that we've now graduated from click to tap. You finally got to tap the bell for notifications so that you know when an episode drops, and follow us, of course, on our other platforms, Facebook and Instagram. So this is a really cool topic. I know that a lot of people got a kick out of our first edition of this when we did a first century Mass, first century liturgy, and we kind of, based on the scant sources that we have, some, allusions in the New Testament, we were able to sort of kind of put together a vision, right, of what a first century Eucharistic gathering may have looked like. So we kind of need to do the same thing here, right? But we do have a little bit more source material to work with. But there's still some difficulty.
I would just encourage our groupies and listeners to go back and maybe review that first video and then tune into this one to be able to see some of the developments that are taking place in the second century.
Yeah, contrary to popular belief, theological podcasts do have groupies apparently. so we're going to be looking at, first let's kind of set the stage. We've talked about not only a first century Mass, first century liturgy, but even in our second, when we got into the second century, we kind of talked about the day that Christians are worshiping on. We've kind of talked about, like, is this tied to Passover? Is it not? So why don't we start by just kind of resituating where we left off when we talked about, like, the day of worship and the proper context for this meal.
Yeah. We had two videos really then. So the first century Mass video we had, and it set the Eucharist in the context, not necessarily just the Passover meal or the Seder meal, but in the wider Greco-Roman context of the Symposium. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of the form that was followed by St. Paul. And we see pretty often, not only in the second century, but also even in the New Testament, how the Eucharist or the breaking of the bread was kind of separated even from the Passover event or the Seder meal. And so it was kind of its own thing. And so I think we could say that to view the Eucharist primarily through the Seder lens would be the incorrect way to view it. It's first this convivial symposium kind of context in the first century. That is that first context for the Eucharist, and then we had that a second video on where we argued for the day of worship or the primary gathering day of the earliest Christians, and we side with the scholars who would say that it is on actually Saturday evening was the agape or the Lord's Supper common meal of the earliest Christians.
Right. Yeah, and I think maybe to the Protestants who listen to our channel, like to Protestant ears, that might come as a shock, but I would say even to a lot of Catholics as well. There's often an overemphasis in popular literature on the connection between Passover and the Christian Eucharist. Not that there isn't an association, of course, but there's a little bit too much baked into what they expect out of that.
What they expect out of the meal.
Yeah.
Because of course Jesus' crucifixion has a Passover context too, as being the lamb that was slain.
Right.
And then the Eucharist's connection to Calvary in that sense is also indirectly connected to Passover. But it just so happens that the Eucharist took place on Passover. Mm-hmm. And so that was an initial kind of context, but the more general context is this meal context of the ancient world, and the role of Jesus dying on the cross and leaving us something in its place.
Yeah, because there's a lot of meals in the Gospels that the Christians are recalling when they're gathering for the mm-hmm. Eucharist. You have the feeding of the 5,000. You have Jesus making fish and loaves for the apostles on the beach after his resurrection. So you have Jesus just at table, like just with various kinds of people, tax collectors, sinners. So the meal context is much broader, in other words, for the Eucharist, and
exactly.
and it's so broad that it also includes this whole context of Passover, but it's not just a one-to-one is our point. I think a good way to sort of start us off is to maybe start with the most famous second century text. Maybe we should just, which is Justin Martyr's description of early Christian worship. So maybe let's just read that, and then from there we'll sort of springboard into other sources and try to reconstruct a second century mass.
Yeah. Oh, look, I have it right here.
Oh, fortune shines down on us.
So I'll read. So if our listeners are wondering, this is in St. Justin Martyr's first apology, written in the 150s, so right in the dead center of the second century. If you want to look for something directly on the sacraments, it would be chapters 65, 66, and 67. But I'll read, for our purposes, 65 and 67. So it's going to start out, little context, it's going to start out with Justin talking about a baptism liturgy, and then it's going to go into a little more broadly the Sunday liturgy, what Christians do when they get together on a normal non-baptism kind of day. So we'll start in chapter 65. Justin Martyr writes, "But we, after we have thus washed him who has been convinced and has assented to our teaching, bring him to the place where those who are called brethren are assembled, in order that we may offer hearty prayers in common for ourselves and for the illuminated or baptized, and for all others in every place, that we may be counted worthy, now that we have learned the truth, by our works also to be found good citizens and keepers of the commandments, so that we may be saved with an everlasting salvation. Having ended the prayers, we salute one another with a kiss. There is then brought to the president of the brethren bread and a cup of wine mixed with water. And he, taking them, gives praise and glory to the Father of the universe, through the name of the Son and of the Holy Ghost, and offers thanks at considerable length for our being counted worthy to receive these things at his hands. And when he has concluded the prayers and thanksgivings, all the people present express their assent by saying, Amen. This word Amen answers in the Hebrew language, so be it. And when the president has given thanks, and all the people have expressed their assent, those who are called by us deacons give to each of those present to partake of the bread and wine mixed with water, over which the thanksgiving was pronounced, and to those who are absent they carry away a portion. And we afterwards continually remind each other of these things, and the wealthy among us help the needy, and we always keep together. And for all things wherewith we are supplied, we bless the Maker of all, through his Son, Jesus Christ, and through the Holy Ghost. And on the day called Sunday, all who live in the cities or in the country gather together to one place, and the memoirs of the apostles or the writings of the prophets are read, as long as time permits. Then, when the reader has ceased, the president verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of these good things. Then we all rise together and pray. And as we before said, when our prayer is ended, bread and wine and water are brought, and the president in like manner offers prayers and thanksgivings according to his ability, and the people assent, saying, Amen. And there is a distribution to each, and a participation of that over which thanks has been given. And to those who are absent a portion is sent by the deacons. And they who are well-to-do and willing give what each thinks fit, and what is collected is deposited with the president, who succors the orphans and widows, and those who through sickness or any other cause are in want, and those who are in bonds, and the strangers sojourning among us, and in a word, take care of all who are in need. But Sunday is the day on which we all hold our common assembly, because it is the first day on which God, having wrought a change in the darkness and matter, made the world. And Jesus Christ our Savior on the same day rose from the dead. For he was crucified on the day before that of Saturn, and on the day after that of Saturn, which is the day of the sun, having appeared to his apostles and disciples, he taught them these things, which we have submitted to you also for consideration.
Great. So there's one initial thing that I would want to point out here, and because this is an oft-quoted text on both sides of, on all sides really of the Christian spectrum. Catholics will read it and say, look, see, it's the Mass. You see the full pattern of the Mass right there. You'll see maybe a more Protestant take that it's a very, kind of a loose, it seems pretty loose, right? We gather together, someone brings bread and wine, he says some prayers. So it almost seems a little bit more like an informality of a more Protestant context. I want to point out here, though, who Justin is speaking to, right? He's not writing a liturgical manual, for Christians to read and then imitate. He's writing to the pagan world, right? He's literally writing, knowing that Christianity,
presumably to the emperor,
knowing that Christianity is not like a legal religion. It's not licit. So he has to be careful with how he describes their gathering, and he is careful. And you'll even notice when he says and then we all say Amen, which is a Hebrew term, which means so be it. He's even associating himself with a legal religion, which is Judaism. So he's trying to also make it sound a bit benign. That it's just like when you guys get together and have your meals, and you offer a cup to the gods as you sit down to have your meals, and then you have your symposium time. So there's a sense in which Justin is going to hold back from a lot of details. So we have to be careful when we read the text as well, that there's a lot of meat that has to be added to this bone. And so that's kind of the goal of this episode, is that we're going to try to add the meat to that bone based on other sources of the 2nd century.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, even the use of his word president, right, for the leader of the church, he's not using the word episcopos, bishop. 'Cause, remember, Justin is still, even though Justin Martyr, he dies in Rome, he's not a Roman Christian. He's from Syria, and he worships with a Syrian group of Christians in Rome, and he's writing in Greek. But he doesn't use the word bishop for the word president in this text. But again, it's because he's speaking to an outside world. He's just saying basically the one who presides over us in a general sense.
That's right. Good. So let's dive into sort of let's talk about this in different categories. So let's start with location. In our 1st century episode, it was very much a domestic context. In fact, restricted to 1 or maybe 2 rooms of the home is where we kind of left things. But now we're starting to see the non-domestic setting coming to the fore in some areas, implying
that's one
some
of the
pretty big growth, right, to the movement, and a very natural move from a domestic setting to maybe like a rented setting, right?
Yeah, that's one of the themes to mark out as we move to the 1st to the 2nd century. That domestic setting is predominant in the 1st century, and Christians were using, as we said, the dining rooms of homes very early on, most likely for their symposiums. As the assembly got larger and larger, they would probably have moved into the atrium in some of the larger homes. That doesn't mean that they didn't celebrate elsewhere. Of course, they could have. Whatever the upper room was, they would have met there and had their assemblies there as well in Jerusalem. But for the most part, it was domestic. In the 2nd century, this is one of the ways we can tell that the Christian movement is growing, because we start to see little instances here and there of other buildings being used for Christians and their gatherings. The house can no longer sometimes in some areas hold them. If you think about a Roman house, even if you were using the atrium, maybe you could fit 40, 50 people in there. Okay.
Right.
But if we're starting to see other public places being rented perhaps by the Christians, maybe this is already suggesting by the middle and late 2nd century that Christian congregations in some places are beyond that 50 count. Maybe they're at 75, 100, 150. So when you look in that in terms of overall numbers, it looks like the Christians have almost doubled in numbers in certain areas. And that's the sense you get throughout the 2nd century. As we've said before, at the beginning of the century, maybe you have 10 to 20,000 Christians in the whole entire empire. By the time we're going to end this century, you're looking at 6 figures. You're looking at maybe 100,000, 150, 200,000 Christians. So the movement is growing steadily, but steadily exponentially. throughout the second century. And so those little increases year by year add up to a whole lot after 100 years of growth. And so Christians are beginning to move into other spaces. A good example would be St. Justin Martyr. In his martyrdom account, in fact, we're told that he gathers Christians above the baths of Myrtinus in Rome. And so his apartment was probably above the baths, and the Christians were now gathering in his apartment in what we would call insulae, or the insula, apartment buildings in Roman cities, where in these apartment buildings you could very well have a common dining hall. Mm-hmm. And that common dining hall could be rented by whoever was renting in those apartments, perhaps to house a larger groups of folks. So that's definitely something to think about. And we do have some churches that we know of were built on top of insulae, Roman insulae. In fact, the famous church in Rome, San Clemente, I had the privilege of visiting there when I was in Rome, is built above Roman apartment complex.
Rub it in, buddy.
Yeah. I was there.
Yeah.
I saw it.
Dan worshipped there among the Christians.
Yeah. So the churches are usually built, old churches are usually built over places where Christians were originally meeting. And so perhaps Christians were originally meeting in those apartments beneath San Clemente in Rome.
Yeah, and a little bit of like to envision that. I mean, Romans are calling these insula, which is the word that they have. It's the same word for island, right? Because these buildings, it almost reminds me of like communist blocks. It's just a building,
self-contained,
exactly, in like little box rooms, all along the way. Very shabbily built. Whenever you hear about fires in Rome, like these are the buildings that usually go up first because they were built of cheap materials, and they were so packed and tightly close together that it just like fires would just spread very easily. But it was typically these little apartments, these insula, were you'd have like the lower part of the building, and it could be many things, right? You could have a bunch of shops called tabernae, little booth shops, or you could have, even like in this instance, you have the baths, and on top are these apartment areas. The top part was called the canecula, which is where you would have, like you're saying, these dining halls, if they had them. That could gather these places, but you were able to rent these, so that's what the Christians are doing in many places now. That they're renting these kind of common areas, and we see this mentioned, like you said, in Martinus. But then we also have, besides the insula, we have other types of rented spaces, right?
Yeah. So there's an interesting account in. We're going to rely a lot on the apocryphal Acts, because the apocryphal Acts, a group of Acts of Peter, Acts of Paul and Thecla, the Acts of John. Mm-hmm. These are great extra biblical works that a lot date from the second century, and so we can garner a lot of information, a lot of good information from these kinds of texts.
Often neglected
in the Acts
actually.
Yeah. In the Acts of Paul. We read that the Christians are renting a large space just outside of the city. And we have the quote for that, Steve.
Yeah, let me read that.
Section.
So this is the Acts of Paul, chapter 10, verse 1. So he says, now there were awaiting Paul at Rome, Luke from Galatia, and Titus from Dalmatia, whom when Paul saw, he was glad, and hired a storehouse or a grange or warehouse outside of Rome, wherein the brethren he taught the word of truth, and he became noised abroad, and many souls were added unto the Lord, so that there was a rumor throughout all Rome, and much people came unto him from the household of Caesar, believing, and there was great joy. And a certain Patroclus, a cupbearer of Caesar, came at even unto the grange or the warehouse or storehouse, and not being able, because of the press, to enter into Paul, he sat in a high window and listened to him teaching the word of God.
Yeah, see, these are great texts because they're they're obviously writing about first century events, but they're writing
They're being anachronistic.
in the middle and the late second century. So they're actually giving us a lot of information about the second century church, a lot of times more so than even the first century church. And it's hard to tell sometimes whether these apocryphal works are meant to be just novels, narrative Christian novels, or if they're trying to retell and write down certain oral traditions. So again, a lot of these traditions in these texts could very well be true instances of what happened in Paul's life. But you can tell at certain instances like this that it's perhaps more speaking about what's going on in the second century.
Right. And actually, we have a great archaeological example of a storehouse like this. It's called the Horea at Ostia. So it's in the city of Ostia. But you see, it's great because it says that he went up and sat in a window, and listened to Paul. The next verse, by the way, he falls out of the window, just like Eutyches in the Book of Acts. So you kind of see,
Book of Acts.
They're kind of regurgitating some motifs of the Book of Acts. But it's pretty cool when you look at that structure, and you can start to kind of envision, the Christians gathering there. You have 2 stories. There's a lot of space there.
Yeah, so you're really looking at that 50 to 100 people perhaps gathering in these types of spaces.
Yeah.
So that's definitely one major theme to mark out for the second century. The domestic setting doesn't go away, but more and more we start to see these more public buildings being rented.
Yeah. Which also would have put Christians more on people's radar. It's like, well, who's this group renting out from us? It's not just a matter of growth and needing more space, but also Christians getting more and more exposure in a way to the wider society. So I hate to do it again, but let's open a can of worms and talk about the timing of this gathering, or what day of the week Christians are gathering to hold the Eucharist. So
yeah, well, it's such a
we had a lot of Seventh-day Adventists
tough
hop on our last episode about this, and it was pretty lively in the comments section. So we're going to open it again fearlessly.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've hashed out why we think it's Saturday evening, why it makes the most sense for the primary common assembly. Of course, we have to remember that Christians are meeting. Even in the first century, the Book of Acts tells us the Christians were meeting daily to break bread together. At least the Jerusalem community was. Now, as the church moves throughout the Mediterranean, it's probably not always convenient for people to meet daily or even multiple times in a week. So I stick to that. There's other scholars who will say that, the Eucharist banquet for the Christians obviously happens at night because it's a banquet, it's a supper. So it's happening in the evenings. And there are those who take St. Justin Martyr, for example, and say, well, see, Justin says the day of the sun. And if we know that it's the day of the sun and that Christians eat a supper, well, then it must be Sunday night when Christians are gathering for their common Eucharist. Yeah. So that's another, you can argue that, right? That's there. We argued that the Saturday evening made much more sense to us just because growing out of the Jewish context of the first century, the Jerusalem context of the first century, and the stress on the 8th day and the movement from darkness to light, from Sabbath to the 8th day, it made the most sense to us that the earliest Christians and then their immediate successors would meet after Sabbath day, which would be Saturday evening for their supper, which in Jewish rendering would have been the 8th day, the new day of creation.
Right.
So in Justin Martyr, the one thing I would say to those who would side with Sunday evening, I read at the end of chapter 67 there in Justin. Justin begins to talk about what was wrought in darkness, right? Mm-hmm. God created. Okay, so he's talking about the light and darkness there, moving from darkness to light.
Yeah,
almost like into the sun. So again, to me, even though Justin is saying we meet on the day of the sun, I would still argue, especially because he comes from a Syrian context, where there's heavily Jewish customs still within the church in the 2nd century. I would argue he's actually speaking of Saturday evening into Sunday, if not already Sunday morning. Mm-hmm. So that's something else you have to contend with, because there's going to be a group of scholars who argue that Justin is already telling us that they're meeting Sunday morning, and this is and the elements of bread and wine and water are token elements and not a full-on meal. There's those who argue that, but then there's others who argue, no, this is still a supper. So it just depends on where you want to fall, and that's what makes the timing of this so difficult, because the sources are very vague.
Yeah.
So I would argue either that Justin is talking about Saturday evening, what was wrought in darkness, and then coming into the light, coming into Sunday morning, or Justin is speaking of the Sunday morning Eucharist that it has already begun in the 2nd century, which could be one of the major themes of the 2nd century, if that is in fact the case. I say that because Christians would have had to have met just before the dawn when they were meeting in the morning, because of course Sunday is not a day off.
Right.
There's no weekends here in Roman society. For the Christians, Sunday is a work day.
Yeah.
And we see from other sources in the 2nd century that Christians were in fact meeting before the dawn. Recall our listeners, Pliny's letter, right, to Emperor Trajan about the Christians in Bithynia. He says, they would meet on a fixed day before the dawn, and then come back together for their common supper,
right,
or eating common food. So before the dawn meetings of Christians, that's common. And so here you have Justin saying this kind of darkness into light kind of terminology. It could very well be that this is a Sunday morning, that the Christians are gathering for this Eucharist, and once the dawn is there, they're about finishing up with their service and heading over into their workday.
So what it sounds like just from what you're saying there, it kind of sounds like what we have is that Sunday morning is starting to kind of come into view, dovetailed with an Saturday evening agape meal, and for our audience, I mean, if we really wanted to just bookend this, we're in the 2nd century, but we do know that by the time you get to the mid-3rd century with St. Cyprian of Carthage, for instance, Sunday morning is already just assumed, for the principal gathering of the Eucharist. So our challenge here in the sources of the 2nd century is, how do we get to that point? And that's what scholars are doing in the 2nd century, trying to figure out how do you get to that point, especially as you're moving from that sort of Jewish context to a more predominantly Gentile context.
Yeah, and that's the point. That's the point itself, is that the 2nd century is that time when, beside the Symposium and supper, the Eucharistic suppers, there is kind of this morning thing going on already. So that by the 3rd century it can move very smoothly into, we meet on Sunday morning for our Eucharist. But it's interesting because, there's again, as with everything, there's a broader context to the Christians meeting. In Greco-Roman society, getting up in the morning and praying, or getting up in the morning and going to the temple or temples, was common practice all throughout the Greco-Roman world. Yeah. Christians are no different. Christians, too, are already used to gathering in the mornings. Again, we'll cite Pliny's letter. He's talking about Christians coming together in the morning before the dawn. And we know that Tertullian, too, in multiple places, talks about Christians coming together in the morning to take Eucharist. In fact, there's a little bit of a controversy going on, because in the congregations that Tertullian knows in North Africa, they are questioning him, saying, well, how can I go to receive the Eucharist in the morning on station days? So station days, if we'll remember, I think we've brought it up in the Didache, we're discussing it, but the fasting days of the earliest Christians were Wednesdays and Fridays, okay? And so those are the station days. And the congregation is saying, well, how can I go to receive the Eucharist in the morning, basically, while it's a fast day? And Tertullian has an interesting take on it. He says, you still must go to God's altar. You still must go to the offering, to the sacrifice. But what you can do is you can reserve the sacrament, take it home with you, and break the fast at home. So in the evening. So the idea of reserving the sacrament and taking it with you back home to eat is in view here. But it also shows that there are morning gatherings already happening among the Christians, at least on Wednesdays and on Fridays. And so why not in many other days? Okay, so I'll read that. I'll read one section from Tertullian's work De Corona. This comes from chapter 3. And again, he first starts talking about baptism, but then he goes into it. When we are going to enter the water, but a little before, in the presence of the congregation and under the hand of the president, we solemnly profess that we disown the devil and his pomp and his angels. Hereupon we are thrice immersed, making a somewhat ampler pledge than the Lord has appointed in the gospel. Then, when we are taken up as newborn children, we taste first of all a mixture of milk and honey, and from that day we refrain from the daily bath for a whole week. We take also in congregations before daybreak, and from the hand of none but the presidents, the sacrament of the Eucharist, which the Lord both commanded to be eaten at meal times and enjoined to be taken by all alike. As often as the anniversary comes around, we make offerings for the dead as birthday honors. We count fasting or kneeling in worship on the Lord's day to be unlawful. We rejoice in the same privilege also from Easter to Whit Sunday. We feel pained should any wine or bread, even though our own, be cast upon the ground. Mm-hmm. So a lot of good, juicy, interesting stuff there from Tertullian. But one of the juicy things is that he's saying that we also come together in congregations before daybreak, and we take from the hand of the presidents, the bishops, the sacrament of the Eucharist in the mornings. And then he also says we also gather not just on presumably the station days, Wednesdays and Fridays, but also, he says, on the anniversaries or the birthdays of the martyrs, and we partake of the Eucharist on those days as well in remembrance of those martyrs. So that could be any day of the week. Mm-hmm. So the larger point here is that Christians are already used to gathering in the mornings, and Sunday morning is no different. They probably would have already been gathering on Sunday morning, at least for prayer. And so it would have been easy, or will be easy, for them to just transfer everything that they're doing to a Sunday morning, given the growth of the congregations, the fact that since the congregations are larger, can we really even accommodate larger suppers anymore? Right. What's really important with the Eucharist anyway is it's the elements of bread and wine and the mixed and water, the mixed cup, wine and water. So that development is in play now in the second century. Beyond that, I would say also that there's this push beginning in the second century, probably because of growing congregations. You don't want to lose track of who's in your congregations, but also the threat of now different sects that are popping up and different religious schools that are popping up within the Christian congregations. There's a push by a lot of the early fathers of the second century to meet frequently. You know, so you have Ignatius in his letter to the Ephesians. You have Ignatius in his letter to Polycarp. You have the sermon of Second Clement, the letter of Barnabas, chapter 47. All of these documents are pushing for more frequent assemblies. Mm-hmm. So whatever happened between the Jerusalem church in the mid first century and the early second century, the frequency of the gatherings probably lessened, and now the second century fathers are pushing more. Okay, let's meet more and more often.
Yeah, which makes sense too, because when you look at the Jerusalem community of the first century and the early second century is a very unique type of community. It could be idealized in the book of Acts, of course, but there's a certain element, there's a kernel of truth to it, of course, when they say that they held all things in common. It's almost like an Essene type of situation, where people are literally living in community with one another. Yeah. That seems to be somewhat in view in the Jerusalem model, but that model is not sustainable, for all Christians everywhere. And so as you're moving out into this Gentile world, where, like you're saying, these are work days, you can't just do what you want, things are going to shift and change.
Yeah. Well, which was the other?
Go ahead.
Which was the other reason why we sided with the Saturday evenings, because it wasn't a work day for the Jews,
Right.
And so that was the day that they could commonly gather, and then we would have to guess that the successors to them would continue that tradition.
Well, which is why you're also hearing, like, even though it is morning, it's like just before daybreak, X, Y, and Z is happening, you know, and that's because, well, yeah, because we have to work, you know.
Yeah.
So it doesn't seem to be a matter of theology necessarily, right? But it really does come down to a difference of time reckoning between the Greek, Jewish, and Roman models, you know. But everybody, all Christians are agreeing that the principal gathering for the Eucharist is the eighth day. You know, this concept of the eighth day.
Right. Whether that meant in their mind Saturday evening, Sunday morning, or Sunday evening, it doesn't really matter unless you want to be a historian and want to try and figure it out. But the eighth day theologically is the one thread that runs through all of the fathers. Yeah.
Yeah, and that the ultimate end of this is going to be a principal gathering of Christians on a Sunday morning. So we're kind of in the mess of that, and people just need to rest in that. You just need to rest in the fact that this is a little confusing. You know,
yeah.
What day the principal gathering is, or what time of day the principal gathering is happening.
Yeah.
So let's go through, let's get into the actual ritual. So let's look at maybe the shape of the ritual and kind of where scholars land on that spectrum, because you have these sort of two different models in a way, right? Where you could have teaching and preaching before the reception of the elements, you know, or you can have this teaching and preaching that takes place after the communal meal. But what seems to be happening, we would say, in the 2nd century is that the teaching and preaching before the reception seems to be becoming a standard, right?
Well, Justin Martyr would be the first example of it. So Justin Martyr would be the first example of teaching and instruction and perhaps readings happening before the Eucharist proper. Every other episode contemporary to him and before him would be the traditional Symposium pattern, which was first to do the Eucharist banquet, to eat first, and then after you have your Symposium, your song singing, your lecturing, all of that going on. But now we see it starting to flip, and so that's one thing to mark out for the 2nd century. Another great theme to mark out is that flip is beginning to take place, and it doesn't for those scholars who would, and for those of us who would agree with those scholars who say that Justin Martyr is speaking of a Sunday morning taking of the Eucharist, a token taking of the Eucharist, not a full meal. You know, that form isn't just for instances of token eating. We also see, interestingly enough, the form of reading and instruction first, even among some examples of Symposium. So for some reason, Christians are flipping the order, the traditional order of the Symposium. Okay, and it can't just be that, but that's because they're transferring the Eucharist to Sunday morning. No, because the suppers are starting to turn that way too. So what else is going on? Why do the Christians feel they have to flip that? And really the only practical, in my view, and in a lot of scholars' views, the practical explanation is that since the Christians are growing, their congregations are growing throughout the 2nd century, and they're growing filled with a bunch of Gentiles who are no longer Jews or necessarily God-fearers, who don't really know the Scriptures. You couldn't have a situation where you did the Eucharist first, because we already know that canonical rules are being set in place that you can't partake of the Eucharist unless you are baptized. Right. And Justin Martyr would add, baptized and agree with everything that we say. So, in other words, baptized and are Orthodox. Yeah. So you have a situation where a bunch of Gentiles are coming in. Now, if you were to continue to have the Eucharistic ritual first, it'd be very difficult to predict when that would end and when you could invite the catechumens in. So, in other words, the growth of the catechumenate throughout the 2nd century is forcing Christians to switch the order, to be instruction first, readings first, so that they can instruct the catechumens. And then once the instruction is over and the readings are over, now they can be excused, and now we can celebrate the Eucharist. And that doesn't matter if it's symposium or if it's the token ritual on a Sunday morning, for example.
Right. Yeah, and I've heard you in the past, like when we used to talk about this kind of stuff, I've heard you use the labels, discernment form versus, of course, what we've been talking about, the symposium form. So, like, maybe let's bring that language in here and let's talk about discernment form and what we really mean by that.
Yeah. So we would call this the discernment form because the form that says, okay, the readings and the homily or the sermon are first, and then the Eucharist. That form that came to be the form of all of Catholic Christianity, we would refer to as discernment form because that's the time of discerning, the part of reading and instruction that refers to the catechumens, discerning the faith, right? Learning the faith, deciding whether or not they want to be initiated into the mysteries of Christianity, baptism and Eucharist. To shorthand for people, we would call it discernment form, whereas symposium form is that supper form, where you have the eating first and then the instruction second.
And it seems like these two forms sometimes, again, are still kind of existing simultaneously because even in the same writers, I mean, like it's kind of hard to tell, even with someone as late as Tertullian, like 197, anywhere from 197 to like 203, 205. So, for instance, in Apologeticum 39, you see this kind of reference to a symposium type form.
Well, it
right?
feels like it in chapter 39. Actually, what's funny is that same chapter, you'll have scholars who come down on one side saying, no, he's talking about a symposium form, and others come down and say, no, he's talking about the other form, what we would call discernment form. It's actually very hard to tell.
Let me read it. So he says, the participants, before reclining, taste first of prayer to God. So just pause right there. What does that include, right?
What does that include? Yeah.
Exactly. So the participants before reclining taste first of prayer to God. As much is eaten as satisfy the cravings of hunger, as much is drunk as befits the chaste. They say, it is enough, as those who remember that even during the night they have to worship God. They talk as those who know that the Lord is one of their auditors. So again, thinking about there's speech happening, right? After manual washing and the bringing in of lights, each is asked to stand forth and sing as he can a hymn to God, either one from the Holy Scriptures or one of his own composing, a proof, by the way, of the measure of their drinking. As the feast commenced with prayer, so with prayer it is closed. So that's very confusing because even like song singing was in a Greco-Roman, dipnon context. During symposium time, the singing stuff would be happening,
Right.
So it's kind of like, okay, he says they start with prayer. There's speech as though God is the one listening. And you're like, well, that sounds like symposium time. Then they do the meal. He's like, and then they do singing.
Yeah.
And so it begun with prayer and ends with prayer. So it's almost like Tertullian has almost like both going on in a way. It's like a symposium and a discernment form on top of each other.
Yeah, well, and both at the same time in Tertullian's congregations, because he'll speak of suppers in one instance, but then he'll speak of morning Eucharists in another. And in those morning Eucharists, it's clear that the prayers are first, and then the Eucharist occurs. So again, it's side by side in the second century.
And in his document De Corona, he shows more clear of a discernment form where everything, all the the reading and all the what Vatican II times would call the liturgy of the word in a way, the readings and speech and sermons.
Yeah,
and
you
stuff
also
was taking place before the meal.
Yeah, and then the Apocrypha is helpful too. You'll see in the Acts of Paul, early on in the Acts of Paul in chapter 3, it's the it's the Symposium form, or it seems to be the Symposium form. And then in the Acts of Paul, chapter 9, it's then the discernment form.
Right.
So and so this is another reason why I tend to side with the scholars who think that Justin Martyr in his description is speaking of a Sunday morning, because it is in that discernment, that quicker discernment form. And it seems like the discernment form, like in the Acts of Paul, happens at times when the Eucharist is like almost occasional. Like, okay, we're going to do the Eucharist, okay? And this is the form we're going to do it in. So, maybe not. But Clementa, so Justin Martyr is definitely discernment form, okay, for a clear example. Some parts of Tertullian are discernment form. Other parts still maintain perhaps the Symposium form.
Or just overlapping.
And then you have,
it may be that they're just completely overlapping. Yeah.
Right. And then you have Clement of Alexandria. Clement of Alexandria, he says in Stromata, chapter 6, and giving thanks always for all things to God, by righteous hearing and divine reading, by true investigation, by holy oblation, by blessed prayer, lauding, hymning, blessing, praising, such a soul is never at any time separated from God. So there you see a discernment pattern. Him speaking of the liturgy there. That first there's hearing and divine reading, then investigation, which probably speaks to the homily, investigating the things that was read, and then the holy oblation, the holy sacrifice, the holy offering, and then final prayers and hymns. So the map should sound confusing, because it is, because the church in the 2nd century is growing, and it's in a transitioning phase here, and it's in the pattern of its liturgy.
Yeah, and let me just say, pause for a second and fast forward to today to kind of bring this home to the modern world. In the West, what we're calling the discernment form is ubiquitous, However, in the East, when you look at the Orthodox, the sermon actually a lot of times comes at the end. So if you go to like a Greek Orthodox church, and you're sitting through the whole service, it starts with the deacon with the prayers and all these things, and then you have the Eucharist, and at the tail end, the priest comes out and gives a sermon. So it's kind of like more of the Symposium, like echoes of the Symposium form still there, right? So this stuff doesn't necessarily go away, There's a sense in which even the modern ritual of the church, East and West, is sort of maintaining two forms. But okay, so let's dial in a little bit to the reading and the instruction time. So whether it's coming before or after, let's drill into that just a little bit, because there's significance to sort of what they're reading, right?
There is. It's interesting. So Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, so the big hitters of the 2nd century, even Tertullian, they all...
The Babe Ruths.
Yeah, the big hitters. They all tell us what's being read in the congregations. And they all say either the Memoirs of the Apostles, the Gospels in some instances, and then the prophets. Unanimously, they all say that. Nowhere does it ever say that the Christians read from the Torah.
Right.
The first 5 books of Moses are not in view, for the most part, in the 2nd century. The focus is on, of course, Paul's letters, some of the Gospels, if some of these congregations have them, 1 or 2 or maybe all 4. By the end of the 2nd century, probably all 4. And then the prophets, because, of course, the Christians are seeing themselves as the fulfilled people. And so they see in the prophets kind of the proto-gospel, right? All of the prophecies of the gospel itself. And so it was natural for them to see themselves as the people of the 8th day, and therefore to be reading publicly the prophets who back up their gospel, right?
Well, also the fact that the rabbis have shied away at this point from emphasizing the prophets. They're emphasizing Torah, right? So there's a sense in which Christians are maintaining this love of the prophets, the Psalms, and the rabbis are kind of shying away from that because they've seen where it can lead if people aren't properly instructed, right, in Torah. So they're being sure to emphasize the Mosaic law. But go ahead.
Yeah. So the reading of the Old Testament isn't really the reading of the Torah isn't really in view at this point. There are exceptions, of course, going back probably to the 2nd or 3rd century in the heavily Jewish areas of the church. So in Syria, you do have a tradition of reading of the Old Testament Torah. Don't forget also Melito of Sardis. Melito of Sardis gives a sermon on Pascha, on the Passover, and he is commenting on in his sermon from Exodus, the Passover from the Exodus readings that they just read in the congregation. So there are exceptions, but almost unanimously among the big names in the 2nd century, and even the Muratorian canon. We haven't spoken about that yet. I don't think we've mentioned that in any of our previous episode. But towards the end of the 2nd century in Rome, there is a canon, the first of its kind, put out, and some of the commentary in that canon mention that what's read out in the churches are the Gospels and the prophets, or the memoirs of the apostles and the prophets. So it's almost unanimous that that's pretty much the tradition of the church. I'm going to sneak this in because I also think that this
is evidence of some of our claims, right?
I also think this is evidence. I think this is evidence of Saturday evening gatherings,
right?
Because if you think about the first and early 2nd century church, they don't need to hear from the Torah. Why? Because they just heard the Torah in the morning.
They're at synagogue, right?
They're at synagogue Saturday morning, and they listen to the law, the reading of the law, and the instruction on the law all morning long. And people like Josephus and Philo say that synagogue meetings could have gone all the way to the afternoon, all the way to 3 o'clock, the ninth hour.
Yeah. They were tore out by the time it was time to set
definitely
the agape.
tore it out. But it makes sense, right? That the tradition that the Gentile church received then was the tradition of reading the prophets and the Gospels and the memoirs of the apostles, because the Jewish Christians had their Torah instruction, and then they moved into the evening which was the 8th day, and on the 8th day they're hearing the prophecies in the dark from the prophets, and then they're reading the Gospels, and they're moving into the Eucharist, right?
Which shows that they're moving chronologically through the Scriptures,
right, through time
from the Christian perspective. But then once you have this kind of like this divorce from synagogue, now that there goes Torah, and Torah readings with it, which is why it is pretty interesting that when you look at like the Roman Rite, for instance, like the actual like traditional Latin Mass, there isn't a Torah. There's no Old Testament reading. Right?
So it takes time for the Church Universal to reintroduce readings from the Torah, and that starts to take place in the 3rd and 4th centuries, actually.
Yeah, and there's a great section in Bradshaw's book, right, about all of this, about the readings and all that. I think it'd be worth it just to read it. I mean, I know it's a little lengthy, but it's really worth it.
Yeah. So Dr. Paul Bradshaw, he taught at Notre. He taught at Notre Dame. He was a liturgy historian. He himself, I think, was Episcopalian, but Paul Bradshaw is one of the leading liturgical scholars in the world, really. Anyway, this is from his book, Eucharistic Origins. He writes, what seems probable, therefore, is that predominantly Gentile congregations are less likely to have replicated the Jewish assemblies for study in their patterns of worship, but developed different forms of ministry of the Word either before or after their Saturday evening Eucharistic meal, while conversely, congregations with stronger Jewish foundations are more likely to have retained the traditional assembly on the Sabbath itself at first, and only very much later, perhaps as Jewish influence slowly waned, to have transferred it to Sunday to accompany the Eucharistic rite, or maybe even repeated it on that day while retaining it on the Sabbath. Both developments thus owe their origin to the synagogue, but in the former case, the influence is more indirect than direct. This proposal also helps to explain why in some churches, especially those of Syria, with their strongly Semitic character, Saturdays continued to be regarded with special honor, as days when fasting was not permitted and on which in the 4th century the Eucharist was regularly celebrated, and why in those same churches the ministry of the Word in the Sunday Eucharist came to include Old Testament as well as New Testament readings. By contrast, in other churches without such roots, especially those in the West, Saturdays were not so regarded. Fasting was permitted then, and the Eucharistic liturgy did not regularly include Old Testament readings.
Great. And you see there, too, that he obviously takes the same position as us, that the principal gathering was happening on...
He's a Saturday evening guy.
Yeah. Cool. So let's get into probably what would be most people's favorite part when we do these. Like in the 1st century one, we sort of just emphasize like just what does this look like? What are the sights, sounds, and smells that we could be expecting when we just walk in?
Well, we got lucky because we had good 3D videos. But
I know, yeah, we don't have too much of that this time around, but couldn't find an insulae video, man. Couldn't do it. But we have some really shabby diagrams. So we need to try to envision kind of how Christians, when they would rent out these spaces, what they would do with them, how they would organize them, arrange them. What would the sights be, the smells? So let's concentrate on the atmosphere and the trappings. So let's start first with maybe how the congregation is separated.